In the grand sweep of American history, few eras shimmer with the same intoxicating blend of splendor, ambition, and ruthless transformation as the Gilded Age. Between the end of the Civil War and the turn of the 20th century, the United States became a crucible for unprecedented economic expansion. Wealth multiplied faster than at any point in the young nation's past, and towering fortunes reshaped the physical, political, and cultural landscape of a rapidly industrializing society. Yet beneath the glittering surface of progress lay stark contrasts: unregulated capitalism, exploitative labor conditions, and a widening gulf between the elite and the struggling masses. In this complex environment, a handful of families ascended to heights unseen in earlier generations, forging dynasties whose names still echo through American consciousness: the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and the DuPonts. These were not merely wealthy households. They were engines of influence, sculptors of society, and architects of a new national mythology, one that merged opulence with innovation, exclusivity with enterprise, and aspiration with the often unspoken costs of generational dominance. This documentary journey traces the rise of these extraordinary clans, peeling back the polished veneer to understand how power was built, preserved, displayed, and ultimately challenged during one of the most transformative eras in American history. To grasp the dynamics that shaped the Gilded Age elite, we begin with the simple truth that none of these dynasties rose from identical soil. Some, like the Astors, emerged from humble European origins, leveraging opportunity in a young and rapidly expanding nation. Others, like the Vanderbilts, carved their wealth from the frontier of transportation. Still others, such as the Rockefellers and Morgans, built vast empires in oil and finance, while the DuPonts turned scientific knowledge into industrial might. In different ways, each family's ascent was intertwined with the evolving economic infrastructure of the United States. And yet, despite their differences, their stories converge in striking ways. They mastered the mechanics of capitalism at a time when regulation was minimal, wealth was lightly taxed, and economic ambition was celebrated with near-religious fervor. Their influence seeped into every corner of American life, from the railroads that transported millions, to the buildings that define New York City's skyline, to the banks that stabilized national markets, to the political machinery that quietly supported their interests behind closed doors. As we peer into the origins of these dynasties, it becomes evident that the Gilded Age was not merely defined by its wealth, but by the social architecture built around that wealth. High society was crafted, curated, and guarded by those who stood at the pinnacle of privilege. Invitations, inheritance, and strategic marriages were as central to sustaining power as business ventures and resource extraction. These families did not only manage money, they engineered legacies. Their homes became the new palaces of the American aristocracy. Their gatherings became theaters of influence. Their offspring inherited not only assets, but expectations, pressures, and the burdens of dynastic continuity. Yet beneath their carefully managed exteriors, fractures often emerged: disputes over inheritance, bitter rivalries, and the struggle to maintain relevance as America entered the progressive era and modern economic systems began to evolve. Our story begins in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when a young immigrant named John Jacob Astor stepped onto American soil with little more than determination and entrepreneurial instinct. His journey from a poor German butcher's son to the nation's first multimillionaire became a foundational myth in the narrative of American aspiration. Astor's ascent would set a precedent for the dynastic pattern that followed: rapid wealth accumulation, reinvestment into land and industry, and the eventual transformation of economic power into social authority. Over the decades that followed, the Astor name became synonymous not just with wealth, but with high society itself, an intangible yet potent sphere that dictated who belonged, who ascended, and who remained forever outside its gates. From there, we observe the meteoric rise of Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man who began by ferrying passengers across New York Harbor and ultimately reshaped the nation's transportation systems. Vanderbilt embodied a particular strand of American ambition, one grounded in relentless work, shrewd competition, and a refusal to yield in the face of rivals. As railroads redefined the physical and economic landscape of the United States, the Vanderbilt dynasty surged into prominence. Yet their story, like so many in this era, reveals an uncomfortable truth. Fortunes built in one generation can dissolve in another when stewardship falters or excess overwhelms discipline. The Rockefellers, by contrast, mastered both accumulation and preservation. Guided by John D. Rockefeller's meticulous strategies and unwavering frugality, the family developed structures, trusts, foundations, and intergenerational governance mechanisms that protected their wealth despite the volatile tides of public scrutiny and economic change. Standard Oil, their empire's beating heart, was at once a marvel of industrial efficiency and a symbol of monopolistic overreach, prompting government intervention that would reshape American corporate regulation. Meanwhile, the Morgans emerged as bankers of unparalleled influence. Their power was not displayed through palatial excess or grand mansions, though these existed, but through the quiet dominance of financial markets and the stabilizing force they provided during national crises. In critical moments, J.P. Morgan stood not only as a titan of banking but as an unofficial steward of the American economy, wielding a level of authority that blurred the line between private power and public responsibility. Simultaneously, the DuPont family forged a legacy rooted in chemistry and industrial innovation. From gunpowder mills along the Brandywine River to complex advancements in materials science, their trajectory reflected the evolving role of scientific expertise in shaping industrial America. But their story also invites reflection on the ethical considerations intertwined with industrial growth, questions of labor, environmental impact, and the shifting perception of corporate responsibility. Together, these families did more than accumulate wealth. They shaped the contours of modern America, often in ways invisible to the everyday citizen, yet deeply embedded within the nation's infrastructure. Their legacies endure in universities, museums, foundations, public libraries, and countless institutions that continue to influence culture, science, and public life. Yet their stories are not uninterrupted lines of triumph. They are marked by cycles of rise and decline, reinvention and dissolution, and by the evolving expectations placed upon families who commanded extraordinary resources in a nation wrestling with inequality and shifting ideals. To understand the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age is to understand America itself, an America grappling with innovation and inequity, ambition and excess, opportunity and its costs. It is the story of how a young nation, brimming with possibility, became a global powerhouse, shaped by individuals whose visions were as boundless as the fortunes they built. And as we trace how each dynasty rose to prominence, navigated internal turmoil, and ultimately carved out its place in history, we uncover not only the mechanics of wealth, but the complex human endeavors behind it. This is the saga of the families who defined an era, commanded industries, shaped culture, and left behind legacies that continue to ripple through the American experience. This is the story of the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age. The rise of these dynasties did not take place in isolation. Their ascent unfolded within a nation undergoing seismic shifts, industrial expansion, urbanization, waves of immigration, and the steady advance of technological innovation. The Gilded Age was a period defined by contrasts. Extraordinary wealth beside staggering poverty, towering mansions beside crowded tenements, and a political system increasingly shaped by the hidden hand of private capital. Within this landscape, the elite families of the era operated as both beneficiaries and architects of America's burgeoning industrial identity. Their influence extended from the factory floors to the halls of Congress, from the rail corridors that stitched the continent together to the cultural institutions that defined American taste and aspiration. A central element binding these dynasties was their mastery of timing. They emerged in an era when laws regulating corporations, inheritance, taxation, and labor protections were minimal or non-existent. Wealth could grow unchecked, passed from one generation to the next with little interference. The early industrial environment offered a rare window, one that rewarded risk, rewarded dominance, and rewarded those who could consolidate power faster than their rivals. The families who succeeded were those who not only seized opportunity but understood its fleeting nature, using it to erect structures that would sustain their influence well beyond their founders' lifetimes. Yet wealth alone did not grant supremacy. Social standing, carefully cultivated, rigorously protected, was equally critical. Nowhere was this more evident than in New York City, the epicenter of Gilded Age high society. Here, Families jockeyed for position within an exclusive hierarchy. Invitations were currency, reputation was armor. Lineage mattered, but so did the performance of refinement. Grand balls, summer estates in Newport, imported art collections, and a network of alliances formed through strategic marriages. The families who mastered this sphere not only displayed power, they legitimized it. They transformed raw capital into cultural capital, weaving themselves into the fabric of America's aristocratic imagination. The Astors became its gatekeepers. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor, presided over the famous 400, those she deemed acceptable within the confines of high society. Her approval became a form of social currency, her disapproval a near exile. Beneath her authority lay a deeper truth. Social acceptance was not merely about refinement, but about the careful maintenance of class boundaries during a period when new fortunes threatened old hierarchies. Into this delicate ecosystem stepped the Vanderbilts, whose money was vast but whose lineage lacked the patina of generational respectability. The clash between new money ambition and old money tradition played out in parlors, newspapers, and ballrooms, illustrating how social power could both resist and accommodate the transformative dynamics of industrial capitalism. Over time, of course, even the Astors would face the pressures of changing economic and social realities. As the 20th century approached, wealth began shifting from land and trade toward industrial and financial capital. The Morgans and Rockefellers symbolized this new phase, where influence flowed not from inherited estates, but from complex networks of investment, production, and national infrastructure. These families did not merely participate in capitalism, they shaped its architecture. Their decisions determined the fate of entire industries. Their strategies guided regulatory frameworks, and in times of crisis, their resources stabilized national markets when the government lacked the tools to do so. The DuPonts, with their roots in chemistry and industrial science, embodied another dimension of the era, innovation as a cornerstone of power. Their story underscores how the Gilded Age was more than an accumulation of wealth, it was an accumulation of capabilities. Scientific expertise, technological advancement, and industrial diversification became keys to maintaining relevance in a country racing toward modernization. As America expanded into manufacturing, infrastructure, and eventually global influence, families who adapted to these shifts extended their dominance into the new century. But the dynasties of the Gilded Age were not immune to criticism or consequence. Public discontent simmered beneath the surface. Labor strikes erupted in response to dangerous working conditions and low wages. Journalists exposed corruption, monopolistic practices, and the vast influence these families wielded over politics. The economic gap between rich and poor became increasingly difficult to ignore. It was within this tension between admiration and resentment, between innovation and exploitation, that the Gilded Age elite carved their legacies. Their stories, spanning continents, generations, and industries, form a mosaic of ambition and complexity. Each family offers a lens into a different facet of American development. The Astors into social hierarchy, the Vanderbilts into transportation and excess, the Rockefellers into corporate consolidation and philanthropy, the Morgans into financial authority, and the DuPonts into industrial science and longevity. Together, they illuminate the forces that shaped modern America, its opportunities, its inequities, its cultural identity, and its evolving relationship with wealth. As we continue this journey, we move deeper into the lives, conflicts, triumphs, and failures of the dynasties who ruled the Gilded Age. Their fortunes rose and fell. Their influence expanded and contracted. Their legacies evolved, sometimes in alignment with their founders' visions, and sometimes in ways that challenged everything they once represented. But through it all, they remained central players in the American story. Their power was vast, their impact enduring, and their histories reveal not only who they were, but what America was becoming. As America transitioned deeper into the industrial era, the economic landscape became a battleground where ambition, innovation, and calculated strategy determined the victors. The dynasties that emerged at the forefront did not simply build businesses, they engineered empires. Each family, with its own set of values, methods, and motivations, contributed to a broader transformation sweeping across the nation. Railroads, steel production, oil refining, chemical manufacturing, and banking became the pillars on which these fortunes rose, reshaping the social and physical contours of the United States. Their ascent mirrored the country's explosive growth, and their influence became inseparable from the trajectory of American power. To understand these dynasties is to understand the mechanisms of opportunity during the Gilded Age. This was an era defined not only by the accumulation of wealth, but by the unprecedented consolidation of industries. A few individuals possessed the vision, and in many cases, the ruthlessness to dominate entire sectors. Their enterprises eclipsed traditional boundaries, stretching across states, infiltrating political institutions, and forging patterns of labor and consumption that touched every American life. This concentration of economic authority marked a pivotal shift. Business leaders were no longer just participants in markets. They became architects of the national economy. The railroads exemplified this transformation. They connected regions previously isolated by geography, opened vast territories to commerce, and established the logistical backbone of the nation. But railroads also became the arena where competition morphed into consolidation. Wealthy magnates recognized that control over transportation meant control over trade itself. Rates could be manipulated, competitors squeezed, and agreements forged in private rooms determined prices for entire industries. Families like the Vanderbilts positioned themselves at the center of this movement, building networks of rail lines that stretched from coast to coast. Their empire symbolized the possibilities of the era, limitless expansion, fueled by relentless determination and fortified by financial daring. Similarly, the emergence of the oil industry reshaped America's economic destiny. What began as a chaotic array of small refiners soon evolved into a system dominated by a singular force. The Rockefeller family, through a combination of strategic acquisitions, transportation agreements, and aggressive pricing, created a structure that would redefine industrial organization. Oil was not simply a commodity. It became the lifeblood of America's growth, powering factories, illuminating cities, and eventually fueling automobiles. The scale and efficiency of the Rockefeller enterprise introduced a new model of corporate power, one that lawmakers struggled to confront and the public struggled to comprehend. Finance, too, underwent a dramatic metamorphosis. The Morgans, wielding global networks and unmatched access to capital, served as intermediaries between American industry and European markets. They stabilized railroads, financed government debts, and played decisive roles during periods of economic crisis. Their influence extended beyond banking into the realm of national governance. Political leaders often turned to them, not only for counsel but for direct intervention when the country faced instability. The Morgan dynasty demonstrated how financial authority could surpass even the reach of elected institutions, raising questions about where true power resided in the rapidly expanding republic. Meanwhile, the DuPonts pursued a different path, one rooted in scientific advancement and industrial diversification. Their innovations in materials, chemicals, and manufacturing propelled the nation forward in ways that were less visible to the public but no less consequential. Their laboratories became engines of discovery, producing technologies that touched everything from agriculture to warfare. The family's rise illustrated the growing importance of intellectual capital in the modern economy, showing that innovation could be just as potent a source of power as financial leverage or territorial control. Across these dynasties, patterns begin to emerge. Each family navigated the Gilded Age through a blend of innovation, strategy, and adaptability. They identified moments of vulnerability within industries and exploited them. They built alliances, sometimes cooperative, sometimes adversarial, that allowed them to shape competitive landscapes. They understood that the future belonged not to those who simply amassed wealth, but to those who could institutionalize it. Their personal lives, too, reflected the era's contradictions. They lived in mansions that rivaled European palaces, hosted elaborate social events, and cultivated refined public personas. Yet beneath the surface lay conflicts, family rivalries, succession disputes, and the pressures of maintaining success across generations. Their stories were not merely triumphs of wealth, they were struggles for identity, legacy, and permanence in a world undergoing rapid transformation. Labor unrest, political scrutiny, and economic downturns challenged their authority at various points. Workers demanded safer conditions. Journalists exposed abuses. Legislators attempted to regulate markets that had grown far beyond their oversight. Yet despite these pressures, many dynasties endured reinventing themselves, diversifying their interests, and weaving their influence into the institutional fabric of American life. As we move deeper into the narrative, We will examine the paths each dynasty forged, the strategies they employed, and the legacies they left behind. Together, their stories form a sweeping portrait of power, how it is built, how it is wielded, and how it is preserved. This is the story of the families who ruled the Gilded Age, whose impact continues to shape the United States long after the glitter of their era has faded. Their ascent was not merely a consequence of individual brilliance or entrepreneurial daring, it reflected the unique conditions of a nation in transition. The United States of the late 19th century was a fertile landscape for those capable of recognizing structural opportunities. There were no federal income taxes, no meaningful regulations on monopolies, no stringent corporate disclosure requirements, and no substantial limitations on inheritance. Economic life operated on a frontier mindset, even as cities swelled with factories and new technologies reshaped daily existence. Into this environment stepped men and families whose ambitions matched the scale of the nation's expansion. They saw possibility where others saw chaos, and they moved swiftly to impose order that benefited their vision of prosperity. Among the first of these dynasties to shape the American imagination were the Astors. Their wealth, built initially on furs and real estate, became synonymous with social prestige. In a nation still defining its cultural identity, the Astors established themselves as arbiters of taste, setting boundaries around who could be admitted into society's uppermost ranks. But theirs was not simply a story of inherited privilege. It was a case study in how social capital could become an instrument of power. By curating exclusivity through invitations, introductions, and carefully staged public events, the Astors created a framework in which wealth alone was insufficient. One needed pedigree, refinement, and acceptance from those who had already secured their place atop the social hierarchy. Yet the Gilded Age was never static. For every established dynasty, there emerged a challenger. The Vanderbilts exemplified this tension. They possessed extraordinary fortune, earned through steamships, railroads, and relentless competition, but lacked the generational veneer old society demanded. Their arrival in New York's social scene disrupted traditional norms. Lavish balls, architectural spectacles, and bold philanthropic gestures gradually forced the old guard to acknowledge their presence. The clash between Mrs. Astor and Alva Vanderbilt symbolized a broader shift within American society. The movement from aristocracy based on lineage to one shaped increasingly by economic power. Economic power found its most imposing form in the industrial titans, who would come to define the age. Few embodied this transformation more fully than John D. Rockefeller. His empire, built through Standard Oil, redefined the scale on which American businesses could operate. He mastered efficiency, created complex organizational structures, and exploited legal and logistical loopholes that others had not yet imagined. His influence reached far beyond the oil industry. Through strategic alliances, rebates from railroads, and an intricate web of subsidiary companies, Rockefeller demonstrated that dominance in the Gilded Age required both innovation and control. His success also sparked public outcry, becoming a catalyst for early antitrust movements. The tension between private enterprise and public welfare, still a defining theme of American capitalism, found one of its earliest battlegrounds in the story of Standard Oil. Parallel to Rockefeller's rise was the growing prominence of the Morgans, whose influence operated less in factories and refineries than in boardrooms and capital markets. J.P. Morgan understood that the industrial economy required coordination. Businesses needed capital to expand, stability to plan, and governance structures to manage risk at unprecedented scales. Acting as both financier and negotiator, Morgan provided these services in ways that reshaped entire industries. His orchestration of mergers, reorganizations, and bailouts demonstrated the increasing interdependence of finance and industry. When national crises struck, such as the Panic of 1907, Morgan's intervention revealed the limits of the government's capacity to manage its own economy. The reliance on a private banker to stabilize national markets underscored the profound influence elite families wielded over public institutions. While the Morgans operated in the realm of finance, the DuPonts cultivated an empire rooted in science. Beginning with gunpowder manufacturing, they expanded into chemicals, materials engineering, and industrial innovation. Each generation introduced new advancements, transforming the company into a cornerstone of American industrial capability. Their laboratories became centers of discovery, contributing to both civilian technologies and military applications. The DuPont's evolution demonstrated how technical expertise could sustain a family's relevance long after its original industry matured. It also highlighted the ethical complexities of industrial expansion, where innovation often intersected with environmental impact, public health concerns, and debates about corporate responsibility. Across these dynasties, one sees a consistent pattern. They recognized that wealth alone did not guarantee longevity. Influence had to be woven into cultural, political, and social structures. They built institutions, museums, universities, charitable foundations not only to give back but to anchor their legacies. They entered politics, funded campaigns, and cultivated relationships with lawmakers. They shaped public policy, often quietly, through lobbying, advisory roles, and private negotiations. And they nurtured family structures designed to preserve wealth, whether through trusts, carefully orchestrated marriages, or tightly controlled succession planning. But the Gilded Age was also a crucible of inequality. The prosperity enjoyed by these dynasties contrasted sharply with the realities faced by millions of workers. Industrial labor was dangerous, exhausting, and poorly compensated. Immigrants, women, and children often bore the harshest burdens, enduring exploitation and instability, while the upper class enjoyed unprecedented luxury. As labor movements grew, strikes erupted across the country, challenging the unchecked authority of industrial magnates. Violent confrontations at places like Homestead and Pullman exposed the deep fractures within American society and raised questions about the moral responsibilities of those who held immense economic power. Journalists known as muckrakers amplified these concerns. Their investigations exposed corruption, monopolistic practices, and unsafe working conditions. Public demand for reform grew louder, culminating in the early stages of regulatory oversight. The Sherman Antitrust Act, though initially weak, signaled a turning point. It acknowledged that government had a role in curbing the excesses of concentrated wealth. While these early reforms did not dismantle the dynasty's power, they forced them to adapt. Families that endured did so by recalibrating their strategies, diversifying investments, embracing philanthropy, and cultivating a more discreet form of influence. The story of these dynasties is therefore not simply one of accumulation. It is a story of adaptation. It is the story of families who navigated shifting landscapes, economic, political, and cultural, with remarkable agility. Their legacies persist because they understood that power must evolve to endure. These were the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age. Their names became synonymous with wealth, authority, and cultural impact. Their influence shaped the institutions that govern American life today. And their stories reveal the profound complexities of an era defined by ambition, contradiction, and transformation. Their dominance was not confined to economic indicators or the grandeur of their estates. It extended into the psychology of a nation still grappling with its identity. For the first time in American history, wealth accumulated on such a vast scale that it disrupted long-standing assumptions about class, merit, and the nature of opportunity. These dynasties became case studies in what the American dream could produce when unfettered by limits, and what it could conceal beneath layers of glittering prosperity. Central to this transformation was the rapid evolution of industry. Railroads stitched the continent together, enabling mass distribution of goods and unprecedented mobility. Steel forged the skeletons of skyscrapers, bridges, and machines. Electricity rewired daily existence, and petroleum revolutionized domestic life and transportation. The dynasties at the helm of these industries did not merely capitalize on technological change, they drove it. Their decisions determined the pace of industrialization, the direction of innovation, and the structure of emerging markets. And yet these families were far from monolithic. Each dynasty cultivated its own ethos, shaped by the temperament of its founders. The Vanderbilts embodied expansion, bold, fast, and unrestrained. Their fortune grew from a young nation's need for transportation. Steamships and railroads became arteries of commerce, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, mastered them with relentless pragmatism. His empire reflected the spirit of a country in motion, direct, efficient, and uncompromising. But his descendants embraced a different philosophy. Wealth became less a tool and more a performance. Mansions, costume balls, and imported luxuries signaled a shift toward conspicuous consumption, a hallmark of the Gilded Age and a catalyst for their eventual decline. Their story demonstrated that fortunes built quickly can also dissipate quickly when untethered from discipline. The Astors, by contrast, positioned themselves not as builders of infrastructure, but as architects of society. Their legacy was social order. In a country with no aristocracy, they created one. Through rigid standards of etiquette, guest lists, and moral expectations, they imposed structure upon a class eager for recognition. Their influence extended into philanthropy, urban design, and cultural shaping. New York's identity, its hotels, libraries, neighborhoods, and even its social vocabulary bears the imprint of their authority. Yet their decline revealed a vulnerability. Social power, unlike industrial power, shifts easily with fashion, scandal, and generational change. The Rockefellers represented discipline and long-term vision. Their empire was methodical, systematized, and built upon efficiency that bordered on scientific. They mastered consolidation, supply chains, and organizational structures that would become models for modern corporations. But what truly distinguished the Rockefellers was their strategic embrace of philanthropy. They understood that influence must evolve from financial dominance to moral leadership. Institutions such as the Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, and Rockefeller Center became instruments for shaping public life. These were not acts of benevolence alone, they were mechanisms of legacy, ensuring the family's relevance far beyond its commercial peak. The Morgans wielded a different kind of power, the power of finance itself. Where industrialists created physical goods, the Morgans created stability, or at least the illusion of it. They understood capital as a force capable of organizing the economy. Their interventions prevented bank runs, stabilized railroads, and restored confidence during national crises. Their control over credit flows made them indispensable to government and industry alike. Yet this influence exposed them to public fury, as Americans questioned whether private citizens should hold more financial authority than elected officials. Their story underscored the paradox of the Gilded Age. The state was strong enough to govern, but too weak to control its financiers. The DuPonts brought science into the equation. They demonstrated that innovation could be industrialized. Chemistry became a business model. Explosives, synthetic materials, and new manufacturing processes emerged not through individual genius but through institutional research and organizational planning. Their fortunes expanded because they invested in discovery. Their challenges came when the consequences of that discovery, warfare, pollution, and public health concerns forced new ethical considerations. Their evolution from gunpowder makers to a global chemical powerhouse reflected the broader shift from mechanical industry to scientific industry that defined the turn of the 20th century. These families also shaped political life. Their donations influenced campaigns. Their counsel guided presidents. Their lobbying shaped legislation. Their networks blurred the line between public policy and private interest. The Gilded Age was not merely a time of wealth. It was a time when private authority filled the vacuum left by a still maturing federal government. In many ways, the institutional reforms of the Progressive Era antitrust laws, labor protections, financial regulations were reactions to the concentrated power these families exemplified. But if the Gilded Age was defined by excess, it was also defined by insecurity. These dynasties understood that public sentiment could turn quickly. They invested in monuments, charities, museums, and public works not only to elevate society but to safeguard their reputations. They curated images of respectability. They funded universities and cultural institutions to shape the intellectual landscape. They embraced philanthropy as both a moral duty and a strategic tool. Their legacies endure because they anchored their wealth in structures designed to persist: trusts, endowments, foundations, and real estate. Yet even the greatest dynasties could not escape the forces of change. New technologies, shifting markets, inheritance taxes, social movements, and evolving cultural values eroded some fortunes and elevated others. Some families adapted, others faded into history, their mansions demolished, their influence dispersed across countless heirs. The story of the Gilded Age dynasties is, ultimately, the story of America itself. It is a story of ambition and reinvention, of inequality and opportunity, of innovation and excess. It is a story of how wealth can build nations and how it can test them. What made these dynasties so influential was not simply the scale of their fortunes, but the way their wealth intertwined with every major institution of American life. Their money shaped cities, financed industrial expansion, influenced legislation, and defined cultural standards. Their names became shorthand for entire sectors of the economy. In many ways, they acted as the unofficial architects of modern America, guiding its development through decisions made in private boardrooms, lavish parlors, and exclusive clubs far from public oversight. Their estates reflected their ambitions. Across the country, palatial homes rose as monuments to their power. The breakers in Newport, Marble House, Biltmore, Rokeby, Glen Cove, Kykwit, Arden, Cliveden, and countless others. These were not mere residences. They were visual declarations of status. Their scale, the imported marble, grand staircases, meticulously sculpted gardens, and elaborate ballrooms mirrored the vastness of the industrial economy that funded them. These estates became stages where influence was exchanged and alliances were forged. The guest lists alone could constitute a who's who of the era's leaders in politics, industry, and culture. But behind the shimmering facades was a quieter engine, the family office. Long before wealth management became an industry, these dynasties created private systems to oversee investments, manage estates, and direct philanthropic ventures. Their accountants, legal advisors, and trustees designed sophisticated structures that allowed wealth to multiply across generations. Trusts, partnerships, holding companies, and intermarriage with other elite families became tools of preservation. In some cases, these arrangements became more powerful than the businesses that first generated the fortune. Yet not all dynasties endured equally. The core difference lay in how they approached the responsibilities of wealth. Those who viewed fortune as a renewable resource tended to secure their legacy. Those who viewed it as a performance tended to see it slip away. The Vanderbilts offered the clearest example of this divide. Their wealth, once among the greatest the world had ever seen, dissipated within a few generations. Factors included inheritance fragmentation, extravagant spending, lack of cohesive investment strategy, and shifting economic realities. Their experience revealed a truth often overlooked. Maintaining wealth requires as much discipline as creating it. By the mid-20th century, the Vanderbilt mansions on Fifth Avenue were demolished, sold, or converted into museums. Not a single descendant appeared on lists of the wealthiest Americans. Their decline became a cautionary tale of how quickly fortunes can evaporate without stewardship. The Astors faced a different trajectory. Though their social supremacy waned as new families rose, their financial strategies, primarily anchored in Manhattan real estate, gave them longevity. Even as their influence shifted toward British aristocracy, their properties continued to appreciate over generations. Their story illustrated how wealth attached to land, institutions, and long-term leases can endure even as social fashions change. The Rockefellers demonstrated the model of durability. They diversified early, established trusts, coordinated family governance, and embraced philanthropy as a stabilizing force. Their wealth became more structured and less dependent on a single industry. The fact that the family remains financially influential today is not an accident. It is the result of meticulous planning, internal cohesion, and strategic reinvestment. They anticipated shifts in policy, public opinion, and market structures, adapting before necessity made adaptation painful. The Morgans, whose wealth and power were rooted in finance, faced more complex public scrutiny. Their influence sparked debates about the role of private capital in public governance. While the breakup of their investment structures and the rise of federal regulation reduced their centralized authority, their legacy persisted through institutions Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan Chase, the Federal Reserve itself carrying forward the frameworks they helped design. Their power did not disappear. It became institutionalized. The DuPonts, with their emphasis on innovation, weathered transitions by repeatedly redefining the scope of their enterprise. From gunpowder to chemicals to advanced materials, they demonstrated that generational wealth survives when accompanied by generational reinvention. Their challenges, environmental controversies, antitrust battles, and public health concerns revealed the cost of industrial leadership. Yet their persistence and adaptability allowed them to maintain relevance even as the industrial landscape transformed. These dynasties were not merely reflections of their time, they were engines of it. Their decisions affected labor markets, technological development, immigration patterns, environmental policy, taxation, philanthropy, and the very shape of American democracy. Their fortunes amplified both the possibilities and contradictions of capitalism. They made extraordinary achievements possible, while also exposing the fragility of systems that rely too heavily on private influence. The Gilded Age ended, but its dynasties cast long shadows. Some remain active in public life, some survive through institutional legacies. Some endure only as names carved into granite foundations or as cautionary footnotes in economic history. But collectively, they defined an era in which the boundaries between wealth and power blurred to a degree the nation had never seen before. To understand them is to understand the forces that built modern America: ambition without limit, innovation without regulation, and wealth without precedent. And though the world they inhabited has changed, the questions they raised about concentration of power, public responsibility, and economic inequality continue to echo in our own time. Their legacies also illuminate how influence migrates over time. In the Gilded Age, power was expressed through industries made of steel, oil, finance, explosives, and rail-tangible systems with physical footprints across the country. Their wealth was visible in grand estates and towering monuments. But as America modernized, the tools of influence shifted. Regulation tightened, antitrust efforts challenged monopolistic control. Income taxes and estate taxes reshaped generational planning. Public sentiment increasingly questioned the morality of unrestrained accumulation. This forces a reconsideration of what it meant and still means to be a dynasty. The families that survived did so by transforming the nature of their authority. They moved from owning the engines of the industrial economy to steering the institutions that surround it: philanthropy, education, public policy, finance, and scientific research. Their wealth became less concentrated in factories and more in trusts, endowments, private capital, and diversified holdings. What remained constant was their ability to move with the currents of national change, anticipating threats and capitalizing on opportunity. The Gilded Age dynasties also left behind cultural legacies. They shaped museums, universities, and libraries that continue to define American intellectual life. Many of the institutions upheld as pillars of civic identity today, from MoMA to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, from the University of Chicago to the New York Public Library, exist because these families chose to convert wealth into cultural capital. Their patronage set standards in art, architecture, and education that still influence modern tastes. The very idea of philanthropy as a public-facing responsibility of the wealthy was institutionalized during this period, though not without controversy. Critics argued, even then, that philanthropic power could distort democratic processes by enabling private individuals to shape public life without public accountability. Competing with the grandeur of their contributions, however, were the costs borne by those not invited into the gilded world. Industrial workers who built railroads, mined coal, refined oil, forged steel, and produced chemical materials faced relentless exploitation. Their lives were consumed by long hours, unsafe environments, and minimal pay. Children labored in mills. Immigrants faced discrimination in emerging urban centers. Women's labor, whether inside home or factory, was undervalued, underprotected, and often invisible. These realities reveal the double-edged nature of the dynasty's achievements. Their rise was facilitated by systems that rewarded efficiency over welfare and profit over protection. Strikes, protests, and union movements throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries were direct responses to the conditions created in the shadows of industrial greatness. The Homestead Steel Strike, the Pullman Strike, and countless lesser-known confrontations challenged the authority of the nation's wealthiest families. These clashes demonstrated the growing tension between labor and capital tensions that ultimately guided significant reforms. The Progressive Era, with its push for safety standards, corporate oversight, child labor laws, and union rights, emerged as a corrective measure to the excesses of the Gilded Age. In many ways, it was the public's response to a small group of families who wielded disproportionate influence over the structure of American life. Despite these tensions, the dynasty's imprint endured because they were embedded not only in economic power, but also in public memory. They became symbols, emblems, of the possibilities and dangers of capitalism. They represented a paradox America still wrestles with: admiration for the self-made ideal alongside deep suspicion of concentrated wealth. Their names appear in textbooks, documentaries, courthouse inscriptions, and across the facades of prestigious buildings. They occupy a unique place in the national story. Part myth, part caution, part inspiration. What ultimately binds these dynasties together is their role as architects of an age defined by transformation. They accelerated America's shift from a rural republic to an industrial superpower. They shaped markets, influenced policy, and built infrastructure that still underpins modern life. They demonstrated the extraordinary heights reachable under conditions of minimal regulation and the extraordinary consequences of such ascent. But their stories also remind us that wealth, no matter how vast, is vulnerable. It is vulnerable to political shifts, economic downturns, cultural evolution, and generational change. It is vulnerable to mismanagement, rivalry, fragmentation, and scandal. And it is vulnerable to the inevitability that every era produces its own new elites. The Gilded Age belonged to the Astors, Vanderbilts, Morgans, Rockefellers, and DuPonts. The generations that followed would see the rise of completely new forces in technology, entertainment, global finance, and digital commerce. And yet the template remains. The patterns established by these early dynasties, strategic marriage, institutional philanthropy, intergenerational trusts, discrete governance, and influence through both public and private channels still structure the behavior of modern wealth. Today's billionaires follow scripts written more than a century ago, even as they operate in different industries and face different public expectations. The echoes of the Gilded Age are unmistakable in contemporary debates over monopolies, inequality, philanthropy, and corporate responsibility. To study the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age is not simply to revisit a period of history. It is to examine the blueprint of American power. It is to understand how influence is accumulated, maintained, challenged, and transformed. It is to see how the past continues to shape the present and how the choices made by a few individuals can alter the trajectory of an entire nation. Their dominance also marked a turning point in how Americans understood social class. Before the Gilded Age, society was largely divided between the modestly wealthy, the working class, and the genuinely poor. There were elites, of course, but there was no clearly defined American aristocracy. The arrival of these dynasties changed that. Their fortunes were so vast, their estates so extravagant, and their social rituals so codified that they created an entirely new stratum, one that blended European-style prestige with distinctly American industrial ambition. This new aristocracy operated with its own informal rulebook. Marriages were vetted for status alignment. Children were groomed for public etiquette and private responsibility. Family names became assets, as recognizable and valuable as any corporation. Invitations to their social events, the Newport balls, the Fifth Avenue receptions, the White House dinners, influenced by their donations, became a form of currency. A place within their circle could launch political careers, secure business partnerships, or elevate new families into the elite class. Their approval was a social passport, their disapproval, a quiet exile. The press played a crucial role in shaping their mystique. Newspapers chronicled their parties, their estates, their travel itineraries, even their children's milestones. Illustrators sketched elaborate depictions of banquets and wardrobes. Society columns read almost like serialized novels, with each family providing new drama, new alliances, and new rivalries. Ironically, the Gilded Age's most private families were also among its most public because their lives symbolized the glamour and contradictions of the era. They became characters in a national story that blended aspiration, envy, admiration, and critique. But while these families shaped public imagination, they also navigated their own internal struggles. Maintaining unity across generations proved difficult. Conflicts over inheritance, business direction, social obligations, and personal autonomy frequently fractured even the most cohesive clans. The very tools designed to preserve wealth, trust structures, consolidated boards, scheduled family meetings, sometimes intensified tension by formalizing disagreements. Success for these dynasties was never just about money, it was about cohesion. Those who remained unified endured. Those who fractured inevitably declined. Philanthropy became one of the clearest reflections of these internal values. Some families embraced giving not simply as a moral duty, but as a strategy to maintain cohesion and public legitimacy. Others viewed it as a necessary but secondary pursuit. Over time, philanthropy evolved from a social obligation into one of the most influential mechanisms of long-term power. Foundations became vessels for soft influence. Endowments secured academic and scientific directions for generations. Museum donations shaped cultural narratives. Public health initiatives redirected national priorities. Through philanthropy, these dynasties maintained relevance even as their direct economic dominance softened. In many cases, philanthropic legacies outlasted the fortunes that created them. Carnegie's wealth largely dissipated, but his libraries remain global symbols of access to knowledge. The Vanderbilt's mansions are gone, yet their university endures. The Rockefellers' corporate dominance has evolved, yet their foundation continues to shape public health and global development. The Morgan Library stands as a monument to one man's passion for art and manuscripts. And the DuPont legacy lives on, not only through innovations in materials science, but through institutions that support research, education, and environmental conservation. This reveals the paradox at the heart of Gilded Age wealth. The most enduring form of influence is not economic, but cultural. Money can disappear, companies can collapse, mansions can be demolished, but institutions, ideas, and public memory have extraordinary longevity. These families understood this, whether consciously or intuitively. By embedding their names into universities, galleries, laboratories, and public squares, they secured a form of immortality that transcended financial volatility. Beyond their philanthropic reach, the dynasties also shaped the landscape of American governance. Their lobbying efforts influenced early corporate regulation. Their connections affected federal appointments. Their financial interventions stabilized or sometimes destabilized national markets. The Panic of 1907 illustrated this vividly. J.P. Morgan, acting with no official title, essentially rescued the American financial system through personal authority and private capital. His actions accelerated the conversation that eventually led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Similarly, the Rockefellers' corporate structures influenced early antitrust legislation. The DuPont's antitrust battles shaped the modern understanding of corporate consolidation. The Vanderbilt's dominance over railroads fueled labor movements that reshaped workplace protections. In subtle and overt ways, these dynasties helped define what government could and could not do. They tested the boundaries of private influence, prompting questions that remain relevant today. Who holds power in a capitalist society? What obligations accompany immense wealth? Where should the line between private ambition and public good be drawn? These questions were debated in newspapers, courtrooms, union halls, and congressional hearings throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the answers shaped the trajectory of American democracy. By the mid-20th century, the world that had given rise to the Gilded Age had transformed. Wars, recessions, technological revolutions, changing demographics, and new industries altered the structure of wealth. Yet, the template created by the dynasties endured. Modern titans, tech founders, entertainment moguls, private equity magnates operate within frameworks built by their predecessors. The scale is new. The tools are new. But the basic architecture of influence remains rooted in Gilded Age logic. These families built more than fortunes. They built patterns. They built systems. They built pathways. And those pathways continue to guide America's most powerful actors today. They also redefined what ambition looked like on a national scale. Before the Gilded Age, most Americans measured success through land ownership, trade, or small-scale enterprise. But these dynasties expanded the horizon of possibility. They introduced the idea that wealth could be industrial, vast, and vertically integrated, spanning mines, railroads, refineries, banks, and global markets. They normalized the pursuit of scale, efficiency, and consolidation. And in doing so, they helped shape the economic identity of the United States as a nation driven not just by opportunity, but by magnitude. The architectural legacy of these families reinforced this ethos. Their mansions stood as monuments to power symbols carved into city grids and coastal skylines. The Vanderbilt palaces on Fifth Avenue, the Rockefeller estate at Kykwit, the Morgan Library, the DuPont mansions lining the Brandywine Valley, and the Newport cottages that rivaled European chateaux all announced a new American aesthetic. These structures were built with imported stone, rare hardwoods, hand-painted ceilings, and acres of manicured grounds. Yet beyond the opulence, they represented permanence. They declared that American wealth was no longer new or uncertain. It was foundational, architectural, and intended to last. Ironically, many of these estates would not survive the century. Demolished, sold, subdivided, or transformed into museums, Their destruction became a testament to changing economic realities and shifting cultural values. Income taxes, estate taxes, wartime pressures, maintenance costs, and new priorities made it impossible for families to sustain such vast residences. But their disappearance only fueled public fascination. The lost mansions of the Gilded Age became relics of a world that once appeared immovable, reminding later generations that even the grandest eras have lifespans. Yet what truly distinguished these dynasties was their ability to adapt. Industrial fortunes are inherently volatile, tied to markets, labor conflicts, regulatory shifts, and technological change. But the families who navigated these challenges successfully did so by evolving from industrialists into financiers, philanthropists, policymakers, and cultural patrons. They diversified their influence as carefully as they diversified their investments. The Morgan shift from railroads to banking, the Rockefeller transformation from oil to philanthropy and global development, the DuPont pivot from explosives to chemistry and materials science all underscored a broader pattern. These dynasties remained powerful not because their industries stayed relevant, but because they themselves kept redefining relevance. This adaptability also extended to their public personas. Some embraced visibility, appearing at galas, supporting political campaigns, announcing donations, sitting for portraits. Others adopted strategic privacy. Many descendants today live quiet lives, eschewing the limelight even though their names carry global recognition. This duality, visibility, and discretion became another hallmark of old money, a blend of public influence and private retreat. Their legacies also intersected in surprising ways. Through marriage alliances, board appointments, philanthropic collaborations, and shared social circles, the lines between these dynasties often blurred. A Rockefeller married a Carnegie. A Morgan descendant intertwined with British aristocracy. The DuPonts connected with political families and institutional leaders. In effect, these families formed a latticework of influence, one not limited to industries, cities, or even national borders. Their interconnectedness amplified their power and preserved their status across generations. Over time, their stories became more than individual family histories. They became chapters in a larger American narrative, a chronicle of ambition, innovation, excess, reinvention, and legacy. They became mirrors reflecting the tensions of capitalism, creativity and exploitation, progress and inequality, opportunity and concentration of power. And through their triumphs and failures, they forced the nation to confront fundamental questions about wealth and its place in society. Today, the echo of the Gilded Age remains unmistakable. Modern billionaires build sprawling estates, fund political initiatives, launch philanthropic foundations, and command industries that reshape daily life. Tech campuses have replaced steel mills. Digital platforms have succeeded railroads as engines of wealth. And yet, the blueprint these dynasties forged persists. The concentration of wealth, the visibility of elite lifestyles, the debate over monopoly power, the moral question of how fortunes should be used, all mirror conversations first sparked by the families who ruled the Gilded Age. The dynasties of that era may no longer dominate headlines, as they once did. Their mansions may be gone, their original companies may have splintered, merged, or reinvented themselves beyond recognition. But their influence endures in laws, institutions, cultural norms, philanthropic models, and the very architecture of American capitalism. They did more than amass fortunes. They engineered systems. They constructed identities. They reshaped expectations. They defined what it meant to wield power in a modern world. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy that continues to govern how wealth is built, preserved, and understood in the United States. Even as their wealth evolved, the narratives surrounding these dynasties became cultural touchstones, stories that Americans return to again and again when trying to understand their own society. Journalists, scholars, filmmakers, and social commentators use the lives of these families as lenses through which to examine privilege, ambition, and inequality. Their rise was studied, their excesses were critiqued, their philanthropy was praised. Their downfall, when it came, was often treated as a cautionary tale. In this way, the dynasties of the Gilded Age became mythic, occupying a space somewhere between historical reality and national folklore. What made their myths so enduring was not simply the wealth they amassed, but the contradictory nature of their legacies. They broke barriers and built monopolies. They expanded opportunity and concentrated power. They revolutionized industries while resisting reforms that threatened their dominance. Their contributions to education, science, medicine, and the arts were transformative, yet their tactics sometimes deepened inequality and social unrest. These contradictions made them endlessly compelling. They embodied the promise and peril of the American experiment. Another defining feature was the sheer pace at which their world moved. The Gilded Age was not a slow or steady climb, it was a whiplash period of rapid industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and technological advancement. Fortunes were built overnight. Companies grew from small workshops to global institutions within a decade. Cities expanded at unprecedented rates. And through it all, the dynasties that ruled the age operated at the center of the storm, making decisions that influenced millions of lives. This velocity shaped their outlook. It fostered a mindset that saw risk not as danger but as opportunity. It rewarded innovation, aggression, and boldness. It attracted people who were willing to experiment with new technologies, new business models, and new forms of organization. And in that crucible of ambition, the dynasties forged systems that would define American industry for a century. Yet for all their influence, the families themselves were not immune to the forces they helped unleash. Economic downturns tested their empires. Shifts in public opinion reshaped their reputations. Regulatory reforms curtailed their power. New industries emerged that displaced their dominance. And generational turnover introduced new personalities, new priorities, and sometimes new divisions that altered the direction of their legacies. Still, the most enduring hallmark of these dynasties was not their opulence, it was their ability to institutionalize their values. Through foundations, trusts, endowments, archives, and museums, they created mechanisms that preserved their influence long after individual fortunes faded. They built structures that would carry their names, ideas, and impact into a future they would never see. Even when their wealth diminished, their institutional footprints remained enormous. Over time, their influence became more diffuse, less concentrated in family hands, and more embedded in the systems they helped shape. Banks, universities, museums, think tanks, and charitable organizations became extensions of their legacy. Their names appeared on skyscrapers, research institutions, orchestras, public parks, and global initiatives. What began as personal ambition transformed into public infrastructure. Their private aspirations became collective heritage. This diffusion of influence also blurred the boundaries between old wealth and new. As later generations married into other prominent families or forged their own independent careers, the rigid hierarchies of the Gilded Age softened. Some descendants entered public service. Others became artists, academics, entrepreneurs, or philanthropists. Their lives no longer revolved around maintaining the strict social rituals of the 19th century. Instead, they adapted to a world in which wealth was less about spectacle and more about strategy. Despite these changes, the dynasties retained symbolic power. Their names evoked continuity in a world defined by change. They represented a bridge between the early industrial era and the complexities of the modern global economy. They served as reminders that the foundations of today's systems, both their strengths and their flaws, were built during the Gilded Age. In this way, the dynasties that ruled that era continue to shape the present, not through the grand mansions that once lined Fifth Avenue, not through the railroads that no longer dominate transportation, not even through the original corporations that, in many cases, have dissolved or merged beyond recognition. Their influence endures through the cultural, financial, and institutional DNA of the United States. Their stories reveal how wealth can transform a country, and how a country, in turn, can transform its wealthiest families. They reveal the fragile balance between innovation and excess, ambition and responsibility, power and accountability. They reveal the human complexities behind fortunes that seemed larger than life. And ultimately, they remind us that eras of great wealth are never just about money. They are about identity. They are about legacy. They are about how a society chooses to define itself when confronted with extraordinary possibility. Their legacy also forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Gilded Age was not simply a chapter of American prosperity, it was a chapter of American imbalance. The dynasties that ruled it rose because the era allowed them to. They operated in a world with few regulations, limited worker protections, minimal taxation, and vast opportunities for consolidation. In that environment, The bold became powerful, and the powerful became almost untouchable. Yet these same conditions also exposed the fractures within the nation: widening inequality, labor unrest, political corruption, and fierce debates about the limits of capitalism itself. The dynasties reacted differently to these challenges. Some fought reforms that threatened their control. Others embraced philanthropy as a means of shaping society according to their ideals. Some saw themselves as benevolent guardians of national progress. Others prioritized preservation of wealth above all else. But all of them, in their own way, helped shape the American conversation about fairness, responsibility, and the moral boundaries of economic ambition. This conversation intensified as the United States entered the 20th century. Progressives pushed for antitrust laws, labor protections, and corporate oversight. Journalists exposed monopolistic abuses. Workers organized strikes and demanded safer conditions, better wages, and a voice in the economic order. Amid this rising tide of scrutiny, the dynasties were forced to evolve. The era of unchecked consolidation had come to an end. Yet even as formal power shifted, their influence persisted in subtler ways. Their companies adapted, diversified, or merged into new corporate giants. Their foundations became arbiters of cultural and scientific advancement. Their political alliances continued to shape legislation, and their private archives served as repositories of national memory, preserving documents, letters, and artifacts that would later help scholars unravel the complexities of the American industrial age. The mansions they built, many of them now museums or historic sites, stand as physical reminders of the contradictory nature of their world, monuments to triumph, ambition, inequality, and innovation all at once. Visitors wander through rooms once filled with glittering chandeliers, imported marble, rare woods, and walls lined with European art, imagining the lives lived inside them. But those same spaces also tell quieter stories: the lives of servants, the pressures of social competition, the isolation that often came with extreme wealth, and the generational burdens of maintaining an empire. By the mid-20th century, the definition of dynasty itself had changed. New forms of wealth emerged: technology, entertainment, mass media, global finance. Old family monopolies dissolved or transformed. Political influence became more diffuse, no longer dominated by a single tier of elite families. Yet the frameworks built by the Gilded Age dynasties remained embedded in the nation's institutions. Economic structures they pioneered evolved into modern conglomerates. Philanthropic models they designed became templates for today's major foundations. Their approach to legacy long-term planning, symbolism, strategic marriage alliances, and institutional continuity remained a blueprint for families seeking permanence in a rapidly changing world. In retrospect, the Gilded Age was both a beginning and an ending. It marked the birth of modern industrial America, and the twilight of a society in which a handful of families could command the nation's resources with little oversight. It was a period of extraordinary energy and extraordinary excess, of dazzling creativity and deep systemic inequity. And at the center of this swirling transformation stood the dynasties whose names still echo across American history. Their influence is not a relic, it is a foundation. Their stories are not merely reflections of a distant past, they are keys to understanding the present. The wealth disparities, corporate debates, political tensions, and cultural values of modern America can all trace lines back to decisions made in a time when railroads cut across the continent, skyscrapers pierced the skyline, and fortunes rose faster than ever before. To study the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age is to study the DNA of American power. It is to confront the realities of ambition, ingenuity, and inequality. It is to witness how a nation wrestled with its own identity and how a few families helped shape the direction of that struggle. Their reign may have ended, but the world they built and the questions they raised remains very much alive. And so, as the Gilded Age receded into memory, its dynasties left behind more than empires of steel, oil, banking, chemicals, and real estate. They left behind an architectural landscape that continues to define American identity: museums born from private collections, universities rooted in industrial fortunes, libraries built from philanthropic ambition, and financial institutions that still guide the global economy. Their legacies became interwoven with the nation's infrastructure, its cultural milestones, and its political development. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy is the conversation they forced the country to have about wealth itself. Their rise sparked national debates about fairness, regulation, opportunity, and the moral responsibilities of the rich. Their fall, or, for some, their transformation became equally instructive. The Vanderbilts showed the danger of rapid wealth without financial discipline. The Astors demonstrated how social dominance can fade when unaccompanied by economic resilience. The Rockefellers offered a model of old money preservation through privacy, philanthropy, and long-term planning. The Carnegies revealed the radical idea that the wealthy should give their fortunes away. The Morgans exposed the power and peril of concentrated financial authority. The DuPonts revealed the tension between industrial innovation, environmental consequences, and corporate responsibility. Each family, in its rise and decline, became a case study in American power. Together, they mapped out the possibilities and pitfalls of modern capitalism. Their stories remind us that dynasties are not merely formed by money, they are shaped by vision, restraint, conflict, and adaptation. They survive only when they evolve. Many of the Gilded Age's grand fortunes disappeared within a generation or two, undone by extravagance, division, or lack of foresight. Others survived by embracing discretion, reinvestment, and strategic alliances, and some transformed entirely, shedding their industrial roots and re-emerging in new sectors with new identities. But even those that faded contributed to a broader cultural understanding, that wealth without stewardship is fleeting, that power without accountability invites backlash, and that legacy is not inherited but built, reshaped, and challenged over time. Today, descendants of these dynasties live lives far removed from their Gilded Age ancestors. Some remain wealthy, but few command the type of unilateral power their forebears once held. Others live as private citizens, their last names still recognizable but no longer synonymous with national authority. Some work in public service, philanthropy, education, or the arts. Others run businesses, invest quietly, or maintain historic estates. A surprising number have stepped entirely out of the spotlight. Many prefer anonymity over status, an inversion of the world their ancestors once dominated. Yet the influence of their families persists, subtly but unmistakably. It lives in the museums their ancestors built, in the universities they funded, in the research they advanced, in the policies they shaped, and in the cultural norms they helped define. Their world may be gone, but its architecture, both literal and ideological, endures. In the end, the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age were neither heroes nor villains. They were human beings navigating an unprecedented era of opportunity, competition, and upheaval. Their successes reshaped the nation. Their failures revealed its vulnerabilities. Their stories capture the tension at the heart of the American dream. The belief that limitless opportunity can coexist with equality, that ambition can align with responsibility, and that the pursuit of greatness can benefit not just the few, but the many. As we look back on their lives, we confront the enduring question that defined their era and continues to define ours. What should power look like in America, and who should wield it? The Gilded Age did not give the nation a final answer. Instead, it gave us a framework for asking the question. It gave us the examples, the warnings, the inspiration, and the cautionary tales. And through the dynasties who ruled that world, it gave us a deeper understanding of how wealth shapes society, and how society, in turn, shapes those who possess it. What the press never fully revealed was that the Gilded Age itself was held together by an unspoken pact among its dynasties, a quiet acknowledgement that their power could only survive if it appeared inevitable. And so, the families who ruled industry also ruled the story of America. Their names were carved not just into stone mansions, but into newspapers, legislation, universities, philanthropy, and the bones of the nation's infrastructure. Yet behind the velvet curtains, the dynasties were anything but united. They competed not for money, of which they had more than they could spend in a dozen lifetimes, but for narrative, for permanence, for the illusion that their family alone was destined to shape the Republic. And in the salons of Fifth Avenue, in the private libraries of Newport, and in the newspapers controlled by their allies, these families sculpted the myths that allowed them to appear noble while their industries grew increasingly brutal. The Gilded Age was a theater of illusion. Every titan played a part. Railroads, once symbols of national progress, were simultaneously the battlegrounds of labor strikes and the foundations of unimaginable private wealth. The Vanderbilts, styling themselves the lords of the rails, had built an empire of steel rails and steam engines stretching across the continent. But no matter how many miles of track they controlled, they could never control the narrative that they were brash newcomers, crude, uncultured, and wealthy beyond reason. So they built mansions, and then bigger mansions, and then more mansions still, each one an architectural scream demanding respect that old New York refused to grant. Meanwhile, the Rockefellers, operating from Cleveland to New York, mastered a different strategy entirely. They hid their grandeur behind modesty, or at least its appearance. They allowed the Vanderbilts to be the spectacle, the fireworks, the family devoured by gossip columns. Rockefeller understood that the most powerful families were not the ones in the newspapers, they were the ones bankrolling the newspapers. And so Standard Oil did not simply refine petroleum, it refined influence. It crafted a family identity built on prudence, order, and a distinctly Protestant moral rhythm, even as it quietly tightened its grip on the arteries of American commerce. The Astors, for their part, reigned not through business domination nor industrial might, but through social authority. Their wealth, ancient by American standards, gave them the air of royalty in a nation that insisted it had no kings. Their ballrooms determined who belonged and who did not, who could enter the highest echelons of society, and who remained forever outside its gates. Yet even their power, seemingly infinite, was built on fragile performance. To retain their throne, they had to pretend that money alone did not define status, even though it was money that built every inch of the world they ruled. But the family that understood the machinery of national power better than any other were the Morgans. They did not need railroads or oil wells or lavish balls. They controlled credit, and by extension, they controlled everything. When the nation trembled under financial panic, presidents turned not to Congress but to the Morgan banking house. The Morgan name became synonymous with stability, order, and the quiet threat that if they withdrew their support, the entire American economy could crumble. It was an authority beyond government, beyond democracy, and it was enforced not through noise but through silence. To look upon these dynasties side by side is to understand that the Gilded Age was not a single story but a constellation of overlapping ambitions. Each family built a different kind of empire. Each family influenced a different dimension of American power. And each family, in their own way, helped construct the mythology that still shapes the American imagination. Yet beneath their gilded facades, the same cracks appeared, cracks of family conflict, unsustainable extravagance, generational drift, and the slow erosion of purpose that accompanies inherited wealth. Because the truth was that the Gilded Age did not belong to the families who lived through it. It belonged to the forces they unleashed. Industrialization, urbanization, monopoly power, national finance, these forces grew too big, too powerful, too unwieldy for any family or dynasty to control. And so, the story of the Gilded Age is not just the story of wealth gained, it is the story of wealth slipping away. It is the story of dynasties rising, colliding, collapsing, and reinventing themselves as the world they built began to outgrow them. Some survived, some dissolved, some transformed, and some left only their names carved into the fading stone of abandoned mansions. But for a moment, a brief, electric moment in American history, these families ruled, not by law, not by crown, but by sheer magnitude of influence. They were the architects of an era that shimmered with promise and pulsed with contradiction. They were the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age. Their dominance was not merely a reflection of personal ambition, it was a byproduct of a nation in transition. The United States, once a patchwork of farms and small towns, was rapidly becoming an industrial titan, and the families who understood this transformation earliest were the ones who shaped it most profoundly. They moved through a landscape of opportunity that had no rulebook, no regulatory guardrails, and no roadmap. And because of this, the dynasties of the Gilded Age were not just beneficiaries of change, they were its authors. In those decades, capitalism behaved like wildfire. It spread quickly, devoured everything in its path, and left behind a terrain forever altered. To navigate this terrain required instinct, daring, and the willingness to take risks that bordered on reckless. Families like the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers possessed this instinct in abundance. They maneuvered through an economic landscape defined by uncertainty, volatility, and explosive possibility. The Vanderbilts, whether admired or despised, embodied the raw energy of American capitalism. Their wealth was loud, unashamed, and unapologetic. Their trains crossed mountains, linked cities, and carried the American imagination into a new industrial century. Yet the spectacle of their spending overshadowed the fragility of their financial structure. Wealth that arrives quickly can disappear just as swiftly, and the Vanderbilts learned this truth with devastating clarity as the decades passed. Their mansions became symbols not of triumph, but of impermanence. The Rockefellers, by contrast, treated wealth as a machine, one that required discipline, structure, and perpetual maintenance. They built systems, trusts, foundations, and networks designed to outlast any one individual. Their influence seeped quietly into research institutions, universities, public health initiatives, and global philanthropy. It was a legacy crafted not for the present but for the centuries to come. While other dynasties flickered, the Rockefellers embedded themselves into the very architecture of American life. Meanwhile, the Astors perfected the art of cultural dominance. They curated taste, defined manners, and constructed social barriers that were as real as any economic divide. Their control was not enforced through factories or banks, but through reputation, lineage, and the quiet power of exclusion. To be welcomed into their world was to be recognized as someone who belonged to the nation's inner circle. To be denied was to remain forever on the outside looking in. Their ballroom became a symbolic courtroom where America's elite were quietly interrogated and judged. The Morgans, unlike any other family of the age, operated on a plane entirely their own. Their influence stretched across oceans, from London's financial corridors to Wall Street's rising towers. They understood before anyone else that the future of American power lay not in land or railroads, but in capital itself. With a signature, a handshake, or a strategically timed loan, the Morgans could steady markets, save collapsing corporations, or redirect the course of national policy. Presidents consulted them. Rivals feared them. And ordinary citizens entered bank buildings stamped with their name, unaware that the architecture around them symbolized a financial empire shaped by decisions made quietly behind closed doors. Yet even as these dynasties wielded staggering authority, they were forced to confront the consequences of the world they created. Industrialization did not lift everyone. It produced slums alongside skyscrapers, tenements beside mansions, and labor strikes that threatened to tear apart the social fabric of the nation. The wealth gap grew so extreme that it reshaped American politics, igniting movements that demanded fairness, regulation, and reform. And it was in that tension between wealth and justice, power and accountability, that the future of these dynasties was decided. Some adapted, learning to navigate a world where unchecked supremacy was no longer tolerated. Others resisted, clinging to a fading era where influence flowed without question. But none escaped the transformation entirely. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had changed. The government had begun to impose restraints. New public expectations had taken root. Transparency, once irrelevant, became a national demand. And although these families still possessed monumental wealth, their ability to shape the country unchallenged had diminished. But the legacy of their reign could not be erased. Their fingerprints remained on the institutions, industries, and landscapes they had shaped. Their names were etched into universities, libraries, banks, and foundations that continued to mold American society long after their personal power had waned. And so the Gilded Age ended not with the collapse of its dynasties, but with their transformation into something new. They became symbols, myths, cautionary tales, and icons. Their stories endured because they reflected the contradictions embedded in the American dream, the promise of upward mobility paired with the danger of concentrated power. For a time, they ruled. And through their influence, their failures, and their ambition, they defined an era that still shapes the nation today. To understand the final evolution of these dynasties, one must look beyond their fortunes and examine how they adapted or failed to adapt to the forces reshaping America. The Gilded Age had been a landscape of unregulated opportunity, but the decades that followed demanded something different: accountability, public trust, and a more deliberate social role for those who possessed disproportionate wealth. Some families rose to that challenge. Others were slowly eroded by it. The Rockefellers, perhaps more than any other dynasty, mastered the transition. As antitrust legislation tightened and public pressure mounted, John D. Rockefeller Sr. shifted the family's identity away from industrial aggression and toward strategic philanthropy. Foundations were created not as mere charitable gestures, but as enduring vessels of influence, institutions that could shape medical research, public health systems, the arts, and education for generations. This was not the disappearance of power, it was the rebranding of it. By embedding themselves into the civic fabric of the nation, the Rockefellers transformed from industrial titans into cultural architects, achieving a longevity few others managed. The Morgans faced a more complicated journey. Their influence in finance remained enormous, but the rise of federal oversight from the Federal Reserve to banking regulations forced the family to cede control over economic systems they once dominated with ease. Their legacy shifted from personal command to institutional permanence. Morgan banks persisted, evolved, merged, and grew into some of the largest financial entities in the world, but the family name itself stepped back from the national spotlight. Their power became structural rather than personal, a quiet force embedded in the framework of global finance. The Astors, long defined by their social supremacy, confronted the gradual democratization of American culture. Wealth became earned, not inherited. Influence shifted from ballrooms to corporations, from lineage to innovation. Society no longer waited for approval from Fifth Avenue parlors or Newport lawns. As the old codes faded, the Astor name transitioned from arbiter of status to historical memory, still prestigious, still respected, but no longer the gatekeeper of the American elite. Their mansions remain as monuments, but their authority over who belonged in America's highest social circles dissolved with the century that had empowered them. The Vanderbilts, despite their explosive rise, faced the most visible decline. Their wealth, built on a scale few Americans could fathom, scattered rapidly through inheritance, spending, and the lack of a unifying financial strategy. Their grand homes, masterpieces of architecture and excess, became too costly to maintain. One by one, they were sold, demolished, or handed to organizations that could preserve what the family could not. The Vanderbilts had ruled an age of spectacle, but the age of spectacle eventually turned on them. They became the quintessential cautionary tale of the Gilded Age, a reminder that fortune without strategy is a flickering flame, no matter how brightly it once burned. Yet even in decline, the Vanderbilts left an imprint on the American imagination. Their mansions became museums, their name became synonymous with ambition. Their story became a parable for the rise and fall inherent in capitalism itself. It is perhaps fitting that the dynasty that spent the most to be remembered became one of the most widely studied and mythologized long after their power waned. The DuPonts, meanwhile, followed a trajectory unlike any other. Their origins in gunpowder production evolved into a scientific empire that reshaped chemistry, materials science, and American manufacturing. Unlike the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts built their dynasty not on spectacle, but on innovation. Unlike the Astors, they wielded influence not through social dominance, but through technological progress. Yet their journey, too, was marked by controversy, environmental battles, antitrust suits, and public scrutiny that forced the family to confront the consequences of their own success. Still, they endured. Their legacy remains interwoven with American industry, their companies and inventions touching nearly every aspect of modern life. They became a dynasty defined not by display but by impact. In the end, what unites these families is not their wealth, but their role in shaping the identity of an era. They were the engines that drove America from its agrarian roots into a global industrial power. They built the infrastructure, the industries, the cultural institutions, and the financial networks that propelled the nation forward. Their choices, ambitious, ruthless, visionary, and flawed, became the scaffolding of the modern United States. And yet, for all their influence, they could not escape the tides of history. The world they created eventually outgrew them. The forces they unleashed, regulation, globalization, technological change, social mobility, reshaped the rules of power. The Gilded Age dynasties discovered, each in their own way, that no empire is permanent, no fortune untouchable, and no family immune to time. But their stories endure because they speak to the central paradox of America, a nation built on equality that has always been shaped by unequal power. The Gilded Age did not simply happen. It was engineered by families whose ambitions collided with opportunity at precisely the right moment. Their triumphs illuminate the possibilities of capitalism, and their failures reveal its deepest vulnerabilities. Today, their names echo through museums, libraries, universities, financial institutions, and the crumbling facades of once grand mansions. They are reminders of both the brilliance and the excess of a transformative age. And though their reign has long ended, the shadow of their influence stretches quietly across the present, shaping the country in ways most Americans never see. They were the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age, and through their stories, the era they defined continues to speak. To trace the final echoes of these dynasties, one must step into the remains of the world they constructed, into the estates that still stand like stranded monuments, into the institutions that grew from their fortunes, into the policies shaped by their ambitions, and into the cultural myths they helped manufacture. Though the families themselves transformed, faded, or fragmented, the structures they left behind became the lasting architecture of American life. Walk along Fifth Avenue, and you find a ghost map of vanished palaces. The Astor mansions, once synonymous with authority, now survive mostly in memory and grainy photographs. Their walls once hosted diplomats, moguls, and monarchs. Today, the land beneath them hosts commercial towers, apartment buildings, and storefronts that bear no trace of the world they replaced. Yet the influence remains. The very concept of high society, the social ladder still climbed by many, was a creation of the Astors, a blueprint for American aspiration that still shapes the language of status. Travel to Newport, and the story shifts. Here the Vanderbilts still stand in stone. Marble House, the Breakers, Rosecliff. They dominate the coastline like relics of an extinct civilization. Their grand staircases and gilded ceilings now open not to elite guests but to ticketed visitors. The opulence inside these mansions is so overwhelming that it reveals the insecurities beneath it, a dynasty that spent extravagantly because it never felt secure in its place among America's oldest families. The preservation of these homes is less an act of celebration than a cautionary tale carved into stone. Wealth without stewardship is a fleeting inheritance. Move inland, into the quiet hills of the Hudson Valley, and you encounter a different kind of legacy. The Rockefeller estates are not monuments to excess, but to continuity. Their landscapes are preserved with meticulous care. Their mansions are neither ostentatious nor humble, but expressions of deliberate restraint. Kykwit, the Rockefeller family home, still overlooks the Hudson River with the same measured dignity it held a century ago. Here, wealth was never treated as a public spectacle, but as a private responsibility, and that approach helped the dynasty survive long after their Gilded Age counterparts began to fade. In Wilmington, Delaware, the DuPont legacy unfolds not in a single estate but in a constellation of properties: Winterthur, Nemours, Longwood, and the powder mills where it all began. Their history is not one of social ascent or financial maneuvering, but of innovation. Their estates feel less like palaces and more like laboratories of cultural, scientific, and horticultural experimentation. The DuPonts, more than any other dynasty, embraced reinvention. They evolved with the times, shifting from gunpowder to chemicals to materials science, ensuring their relevance in a century that demanded adaptation. And then there is the Morgan legacy, etched not into landscapes but into institutions. Unlike the Vanderbilts or Astors, the Morgans did not build sprawling mansions to impress the public. Their monuments are financial banking houses, libraries, museums, and the corporate descendants that shaped the global economy. J.P. Morgan's library, one of the most intimate symbols of his power, still stands in New York City, filled with rare books and manuscripts collected by a man who saw knowledge as a form of sovereignty. The financial institutions that bear his name have outlived him by more than a century and continue to influence the world with a reach he could only imagine. These remnants reveal a truth about the Gilded Age dynasties. The measure of their power is not the wealth they acquired, but the ways they embedded themselves into the nation's story. Their influence persists not because their families remained wealthy, many did not, but because the systems they shaped became the scaffolding of American society. Railroads, oil pipelines, financial markets, cultural institutions, universities, environmental conservation, chemical industries. These aren't footnotes. They are the backbone of the modern United States. The dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age did more than accumulate riches. They carved the channels through which power still flows. Yet the end of their reign as unquestioned titans came gradually, almost imperceptibly. The rise of federal regulation, the shift toward corporate bureaucracy, the diversification of wealth, and the decline of inherited aristocracy all chipped away at the foundations they once controlled. America democratized its economy just enough to ensure that no family could ever again dominate the way the Gilded Age dynasties once had. Their fall was not a catastrophe, it was a transformation. They moved from active rulers to symbolic figures, from power brokers to historical touchstones. They became stories told in museums, referenced in textbooks, invoked in documentaries, and debated in economic history. Their legacies refracted, softened, and spread out across the culture, no longer concentrated in a single family vault, but distributed across the nation's institutions. And in that shift lies the paradox of their influence. The moment they stopped ruling directly was the moment their ideas became permanent. Their empires dissolved, but the systems they created endured. Their names faded from headlines, but the consequences of their reign are still unfolding in the structures of wealth, inequality, opportunity, and innovation that define American life today. Their power was temporary. Their impact is not. These were the dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age families, whose stories reveal the promise and perils of an era that reshaped the nation, and whose echoes continue to resonate far beyond the age that bore them. To understand how these dynasties truly ruled the Gilded Age, one must look beyond the marble facades and towering fortunes and examine the mechanisms by which power was exercised. Wealth in this era was not merely accumulated, it was weaponized. It was transformed into influence, legitimacy, and social architecture. Each dynasty built a different mechanism of control, and together they formed a network of economic, political, and cultural authority that shaped the trajectory of the United States. The Astors ruled through social hierarchy. Their power emanated not from innovation or industry, but from the creation of an exclusive social code that determined who was allowed into the upper echelons of American society. They built their authority on lineage, on propriety, on the careful cultivation of a world in which acceptance by the Astors was worth more than any business achievement. Their influence was subtle but immense, an invisible hand that defined who mattered in a city and a nation still searching for identity during rapid expansion. The Vanderbilts, by contrast, ruled through spectacle. Their rise was meteoric and unapologetically self-made, and they brandished their wealth with a theatrical aggression that shocked the establishment. They threw grand balls, built palaces meant to dwarf European aristocracy, and deployed excess as a form of social warfare. Their influence was less about refinement and more about momentum. They reshaped the cultural landscape by proving that new money could become dominant money if it was bold enough, relentless enough, and willing to challenge the old order head-on. Meanwhile, the Rockefellers ruled through structure. They understood the mechanics of systems, markets, corporations, philanthropy, and used these systems to embed their legacy into the foundations of American life. Their approach was methodical: create stable institutions, reinforce long-term interests, avoid unnecessary visibility, and ensure generational continuity through disciplined governance. They perfected the formula for wealth preservation, not just wealth accumulation. As a result, the Rockefeller influence endured long after more flamboyant fortunes had dispersed. The Morgans ruled through finance. Their empire was not built on a product but on power itself. The power to stabilize markets, to prevent economic collapse, to underwrite nations, and to force entire industries into alignment with their vision. They were the arbiters of capital at a time when capital was becoming the currency of national strength. Their influence was broad, penetrating, and in many cases beyond the reach of democratic oversight. They became the architects of modern American finance, and in doing so, they forged a dynasty of institutional permanence. The DuPonts ruled through industry and science. Their empire grew not from social ambition or financial manipulation, but from an ability to harness materials, chemistry, and innovation at a scale unmatched by any competitor. They reshaped the American military landscape, supplied the nation through war and peace, and evolved repeatedly to stay ahead of industrial transformation. Their power came from relevance, from constant reinvention, and from the strategic use of expertise as a form of national capital. When viewed together, these dynasties reveal the Gilded Age as not merely a period of excess but a coordinated transformation of American life. Their influence extended into labor, government, foreign policy, urban development, and cultural norms. They controlled access to opportunity, defined the standards of success, and determined the boundaries of ambition in a society that claimed egalitarian values while operating under oligarchic realities. Railroads, steel, oil, finance, chemicals, these were more than industries. They were levers of power. Whoever controlled them controlled the nation's future. And while each dynasty wielded power differently, they shared common strategies. They centralized authority. Whether in family trusts, corporate structures, or social institutions, they concentrated decision-making among a small inner circle. They built institutions meant to outlive them. Universities, foundations, libraries, museums, and corporate conglomerates ensured that their influence persisted even when individual fortunes dissolved. They cultivated alliances. Through marriages, political patronage, business partnerships, and elite social circles, they created networks that expanded their reach far beyond their immediate enterprises. They adapted or they fell. The families that endured were those that recognized when the world was changing. The shift from unregulated capitalism to federal oversight, the emergence of income and estate taxes, the rise of corporate bureaucracy, and the democratization of high society. The families that could not adapt, those who clung to displays of wealth rather than the infrastructure of wealth, faded quickly. Their mansions became museums or rubble. Their names became historical footnotes. But the true measure of their rule lies in the systems they left behind. America's regulatory landscape, corporate models, philanthropic traditions, transportation networks, scientific industries, and financial frameworks all bear the fingerprints of these dynasties. Even today, when no single family dominates the national landscape the way they once did, the echoes of their influence remain. The Gilded Age may have ended, but its dynasties continue to shape the parameters of American prosperity, inequality, and power. Because in the end, ruling an age is not about how long a dynasty lasts. It is about how deeply it reshapes the world it leaves behind. These families did exactly that. To fully grasp the magnitude of these dynasties, one must examine how their influence intertwined with the emerging American identity. The Gilded Age was not merely an era of financial expansion. It was a cultural pivot point, a moment when the United States struggled to define what power should look like in a nation founded on democratic ideals yet driven by capitalist ambition. These families became the personification of that contradiction. They were self-made monarchs in a republic without a crown. Their rise revealed a paradox. Americans rejected aristocracy in theory, but embraced it in practice. Without titles or hereditary rule, wealth became the new measure of nobility. And in that vacuum, the great dynasties stepped forward to shape the ethos of the age. The Astors shaped the performance of power. Their salons, theaters, and ballrooms became testing grounds where social rituals were codified and where acceptance into the upper ranks required adherence to strict cultural expectations. They transformed social behavior into a currency, giving form to an American aristocracy that functioned without royal bloodlines. They institutionalized the idea that belonging was earned not through public service or cultural contributions, but through alignment with their version of elite identity. The Vanderbilts, with their colossal fortunes and immense ambition, rewired America's conception of modern luxury. Their homes, their parties, their art collections, these were not mere indulgences but challenges to the old guard. Every marble-clad hall and imported tapestry declared that American wealth could eclipse European grandeur. They democratized aspiration even as they concentrated wealth. They gave the country a new visual language of success, one etched in opulent staircases and gilded drawing rooms. The Rockefellers redefined philanthropy, turning it from a noble pastime into a structural pillar of national development. Their approach was not scattershot benevolence, but organized reinvestment into human capital. They targeted education, medicine, public health, scientific research, and environmental preservation. They saw philanthropy not as charity but as infrastructure, an investment in the long-term stability of a society whose systems they helped engineer. Their foundations became engines of reform, modeling a new American ideal of responsible power. The Morgans reshaped governance without ever holding office. Their influence permeated the American economy so completely that they often operated as a parallel government. When markets faltered, they intervened. When corporations collapsed, they stabilized them. When industries spiraled into disarray, they consolidated them. Their authority blurred the line between private wealth and public necessity. They were not just financiers, they were regulators, policymakers, and crisis managers at a time when federal oversight was nearly non-existent. The DuPonts, meanwhile, represented the rise of industrial science as a sustaining force in modern life. They pioneered technological innovation, controlled the chemical supply chains crucial to agriculture, warfare, and manufacturing, and shaped the nation's industrial capabilities through relentless research and adaptation. Their laboratories, patents, and specialized production facilities became the backbone of multiple American industries. Their evolution from gunpowder mill to global chemical empire mirrored the country's own shift from agrarian roots to industrial supremacy. Through these families, the United States learned new modes of wielding influence. Power no longer flowed solely from political institutions or military might. It flowed from capital, from innovation, from social control, and from the capacity to shape public perception. The dynasties understood this intuitively, and each used their chosen domain to build empires that extended far beyond their lifetimes. Yet for all their achievements, their reign illuminated the darker contours of American progress. The Gilded Age was also an era marked by severe inequality, labor unrest, corruption, and exploitative industrial practices. The dynasties stood at the center of these tensions. Their factories depended on dangerous working conditions. Their monopolies stifled competition, their social clubs excluded vast portions of the population, their political influence often operated outside democratic accountability. The result was a nation of stark contrasts. Unprecedented opportunity for some, crushing hardship for others. But these contradictions did not diminish their impact, they defined it. The country's struggle to reconcile wealth with fairness, innovation with regulation, and ambition with justice can be traced directly to the legacies these families left behind. Their empires forced America to confront the price of progress and compelled the nation to create new systems. Antitrust laws, labor protections, income taxes, social welfare programs to mitigate the excesses of unregulated capitalism. By ruling their age, they forced the country to evolve, and perhaps that is the most enduring part of their legacy. They were catalysts. Their dominance exposed the flaws in the system as much as it showcased its possibilities. They shaped America not only through what they built, but through the debates, conflicts, reforms, and reckonings their power made unavoidable. Today, the remnants of their reign still linger in the bones of the nation, the skyscrapers, museums, universities, libraries, parks, financial institutions, and industrial giants they left behind. Their influence endures in the social aspirations that still echo through American culture, in the philanthropic models that still define charitable giving, and in the corporate structures that still govern global markets. The dynasties ruled the Gilded Age, but their true legacy is the world we inherited from them, one that still operates within the frameworks they created, still grapples with the inequalities they magnified, and still aspires to the heights they once commanded. To understand the reach of these dynasties, we must examine how their influence seeped into domains far beyond their initial industries. Their power extended into culture, identity, and the very architecture of the American psyche. Each dynasty cultivated a distinct philosophy, an internal doctrine that guided their decisions and shaped their public legacies. These philosophies became silent operating systems behind the nation's most consequential developments. The Astors built their philosophy on social preservation. They believed order and refinement were essential to the stability of an emerging nation. Their meticulously curated social circles were not frivolous games, but efforts to maintain a semblance of structure in a society rapidly expanding through immigration, industrialization, and urbanization. They offered a model exclusive, narrow, and deeply flawed, yet culturally influential. They gave America an aspirational image of aristocracy, even though the nation had expressly rejected hereditary nobility. Their power lay in their ability to dictate taste, etiquette, and social legitimacy in a country struggling to define its elite class. The Vanderbilts built their philosophy on visibility and dominance. Their wealth was a performance. Every mansion, every gala, every art acquisition was a declaration that American industrial fortunes could eclipse European aristocracy. They offered a competing vision of power, one that was bold, visceral, and unapologetically modern. Their approach democratized the idea of luxury. If one could build enough, display enough, and spend enough, one could become a cultural titan regardless of lineage. They reshaped American ambition from quiet aspiration to spectacular assertion. The Rockefellers built their philosophy on systemic stewardship. They believed wealth should be engineered, not flaunted. Their dynastic strategy emphasized durable structures, multi-generational planning, reinvestment in human capital, and the careful management of public image. They created philanthropic foundations not merely to give back, but to strategically strengthen the national fabric. Their approach to wealth was almost technocratic, efficient, functional, and deeply intentional. They presented a model of power that sought to outlast trends, markets, and even political shifts. The Morgans built their philosophy on centralized authority. They saw stability as the cornerstone of prosperity and believed that concentrated financial control was necessary to guide the nation through periods of volatility. Their interventions during economic panics were not acts of charity but demonstrations of power. A private individual stepping in, where the federal government lacked the machinery to respond. Their doctrine was rooted in the belief that financial expertise, not democratic process, should guide the country's economic future. Their legacy is etched into the DNA of the Federal Reserve and the modern banking system. The DuPonts built their philosophy on scientific advancement. They trusted innovation more than tradition, research more than social rank. Their dynasty evolved with America's needs, war, industry, agriculture, consumer goods, and environmental considerations. Their laboratories became crucibles of modernization, introducing materials and technologies that reshaped everyday life. Their power derived not from visibility or social hierarchy, but from relevance. They thrived because they remained indispensable across eras defined by conflict, reconstruction, and technological acceleration. Yet these dynastic philosophies did not develop in isolation. They interacted, conflicted, and influenced each other. The Astors' dominance forced the Vanderbilts to challenge the old social order with spectacle. The Vanderbilts' spending prompted the Rockefellers to emphasize discipline and planning as markers of distinction. The industrial expansions of the Rockefellers and DuPonts created economic landscapes that required Morgan-style financial oversight. These families were not merely parallel actors. They formed a complex ecosystem of competing visions for America's future. Their interplay shaped the nation's evolution. Where the Astors built social walls, the Vanderbilts tore them down. Where the Vanderbilts displayed their wealth, the Rockefellers concealed it. Where the Rockefellers structured national institutions, the Morgans consolidated financial control. Where all others focused on capital, the DuPonts focused on chemistry and innovation. Together, they formed a mosaic of power, each filling a different role in a country, learning how to wield industrial-scale wealth. As their influence grew, so did public tension. Labor movements protested dangerous working conditions in Rockefeller and DuPont factories. Journalists exposed Morgan's manipulative financial strategies. Political reformers railed against Vanderbilt's excess and Astor's exclusionary practices. The Gilded Age became the crucible in which America forged its modern economic conscience. Out of the public outcry came antitrust laws, income taxes, labor protections, regulatory agencies, and philanthropic expectations, all responses to the enormous leverage held by these families. Their power provoked reform. Their ambition provoked innovation. Their excess provoked societal introspection. Even their decline played a role in shaping modern America. When the Vanderbilts' empire fractured under the weight of division, taxes, and overspending, it signaled the unsustainability of sheer extravagance. When the Astors retreated from their social throne, it marked the end of inherited social supremacy. When the Morgans faced federal scrutiny, it heralded the rise of government oversight in finance. When the DuPonts adapted to changing environments, it proved evolution was the key to longevity. When the Rockefellers transitioned from industrial dominance to institutional legacy, it illustrated a new blueprint for dynastic endurance. By the time the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era, the nation had been reshaped by these families' influence. Their reign had set in motion forces that made them both indispensable and obsolete. The systems they built endured, but the conditions that allowed individual families to rule an age began to dissolve. Yet even today, their shadows linger, in the museums that carry their names, in the corporations that trace their roots to their empires, in the financial regulations designed in response to their power, in the cultural norms and philanthropic expectations they established. In the very definition of American success, their rule ended, but their impact never did. As the 19th century shifted into the early 20th, the legacy of these families began to evolve in ways that reflected the changing needs and anxieties of the nation. Their empires, once symbols of unstoppable industrial momentum, now stood as monuments to an era that was rapidly passing into history. Yet the impact of their decisions continued to ripple outward, influencing economic structures, social norms, political systems, and cultural expectations long after their personal power had waned. The Astors, for instance, transitioned from social monarchs to custodians of memory. Their name became synonymous with the early architecture of American elitism, its rituals, its exclusivity, its hierarchies. But as new money families rose and the rigid social codes of the Gilded Age lost their authority, the Astors found themselves presiding not over an active empire, but over a fading mythos. Their hotels, libraries, and public spaces became the repositories of their influence, places where the echoes of their dominance lived on even as society moved beyond the world they had curated. The Vanderbilts experienced a more dramatic descent. Their empire, built at breakneck speed, began to unravel within a generation. Their mansions, once statements of supremacy, became financial burdens too costly to maintain. Their fortune, scattered among dozens of heirs, diminished rapidly. Yet their cultural imprint remained. The architectural marvels they constructed, the industries they propelled forward, and the public imagination they captured through sheer spectacle continued to shape how Americans visualized wealth, ambition, and excess. Their rise and fall became a cautionary tale embedded in the national consciousness. The Rockefellers, ever strategic, adapted to the evolving landscape with the same precision that had characterized their ascent. Their shift from industrial dominance to philanthropic governance reshaped their public identity. They became the model for wealth, deployed as social investment. Their foundations influenced medicine, agriculture, education, the arts, and environmental preservation on a global scale. While other dynasties receded, the Rockefellers used foresight and calculating structure to sustain their relevance across generations. Their power became quieter, more institutional, less personal but no less impactful. The Morgans confronted the limits of private authority. Their near-monarchical control over American finance could not withstand the expanding demands for federal oversight. The Panic of 1907, which they single-handedly stabilized, represented both their greatest triumph and the catalyst for their diminishing autonomy. The creation of the Federal Reserve was, in many ways, the government's answer to the question the Morgans themselves had posed. Should a single individual have the power to rescue or control an entire national economy? Their influence did not vanish, but it shifted into regulated channels, where institutions carried forward the legacy once embodied by a single man. The DuPonts entered the modern age with a dynamism few other dynasties could match. Their transformation from gunpowder manufacturers into scientific innovators ensured their survival well beyond the Gilded Age. They aligned themselves with the technological revolutions of the 20th century, embedding their legacy into the materials and chemical frameworks that powered modern life. Their influence expanded into warfare, agriculture, consumer goods, and eventually environmental policy. Their adaptability became the key to their endurance. Together, these families shaped the arc of American development. They were architects of industry, interpreters of wealth, conduits of innovation, and navigators of public perception. Each dynasty addressed a different national need. The Astors gave America its social script. The Vanderbilts gave it its spectacle. The Rockefellers gave it its institutions. The Morgans gave it its financial architecture. The DuPonts gave it its scientific foundation. Their legacies intertwined with the nation's evolution, influencing movements far beyond their lifetimes. The progressive reforms of the early 1900s responded directly to their excesses. The philanthropic boom of the mid-20th century modeled itself after their charitable institutions. The modern corporate structure reflects their experiments with trusts, holding companies, consolidation, and vertical integration. The environmental and labor regulations of later decades emerged from critiques of their practices. Even today, their values echo through the culture. The pursuit of social prestige still follows Astor patterns. The obsession with luxury still echoes Vanderbilt grandeur. The nonprofit sector still operates on Rockefeller principles. The financial markets still rely on systems Morgan helped engineer. The technologies that shape daily life still trace their lineage to DuPont innovations. Yet beneath the surface of their achievements lies a more complicated truth. Their rise illuminated the deep inequalities embedded in the American economic system. Their fortunes were often built on labor exploitation, environmental degradation, consolidation of power, and political influence that undermined democratic processes. Their dominance forced the nation to confront uncomfortable questions about fairness, accountability, and the role of private wealth in public life. Their stories reveal the paradox at the heart of the Gilded Age. America became a global power not despite inequality, but through it. The dynasties flourished in a system that rewarded ambition and punished vulnerability, that encouraged innovation but neglected the human cost. Their successes exposed the need for reform. Their failures shaped the direction of that reform. And as their empires rose and fell, one truth became increasingly clear. The Gilded Age was not only about wealth, it was about identity. It forced America to decide what kind of nation it wanted to be, and what role its wealthiest citizens should play in that vision. The dynasties ruled their era, but the consequences of their rule extended far beyond it. Their fingerprints remain on the laws, institutions, cities, and cultural values of the modern United States. They may no longer dominate the way they once did, but their legacies have become foundational, woven into the structure of American history itself. The imprint of these dynasties becomes even more evident when examining how the United States transitioned from a patchwork of regional economies into a unified industrial superpower. Their actions, investments, and strategic decisions acted as catalysts for national transformation. These families did not merely participate in the American experiment, they redefined its trajectory. The scale of their influence becomes clear when tracing the rise of modern infrastructure. Railroads, steel frameworks, pipelines, refineries, banking networks, municipal buildings, and public utilities all bear the hallmarks of their ambition. They laid the groundwork for the country's expansion into a continental economic force, enabling industries to flourish and populations to spread into newly accessible regions. Their capital shape-shifted into the physical and political arteries through which the modern United States would grow. For the Astors, this influence manifested through land. Their vast real estate holdings created the blueprint for Manhattan's development, turning once undeveloped tracts into some of the most valuable urban property in the world. They did not build railroads or refineries, but their control over land ownership defined the cityscape and shaped the future of American urbanization. As hotels, libraries, and civic centers rose from the ground, the Astor name became intertwined with the early architecture of American social hierarchy. The Vanderbilts, by contrast, transformed movement itself. Their railroad empire connected the nation, turning weeks-long journeys into streamlined routes that bound regions together. Their tracks facilitated commerce, migration, and communication, accelerating the nation's industrial capabilities. While their wealth dwindled over time, the infrastructure they helped to build remains one of the foundational frameworks of American economic life. Their mansions may have faded, but their rails became permanent. The Rockefellers influenced the invisible foundation of the modern world, energy. Their empire standardized oil production, distribution, and refinement at a time when illumination and industry were still expensive luxuries. Their innovations lowered costs, increased efficiency, and powered the transition from rural darkness to urban electrical brilliance. They brought kerosene to the working class, gasoline to the automobile age, and corporate structure to national enterprise. Through philanthropy, they extended this influence into public health, conservation, and education fields that continue to benefit from their massive endowments. The Morgans controlled the flow of capital itself. Their banking empire determined which industries thrived, which collapsed, and which merged into titanic corporate entities. Their influence was not always visible, but was always present, guiding interest rates, stabilizing, collapsing banks, and directing the strategic mergers that consolidated American power. They treated the American economy as a mechanism that could be calibrated, tuned, or repaired through the force of their financial will. Their legacy still permeates the corridors of Wall Street, long after their personal dominance has waned. The DuPonts, ever adaptive, threaded their power through innovation. What began as a gunpowder venture evolved into one of the most influential chemical conglomerates in history. Their products reshaped warfare, domestic life, agriculture, and technology. From polymers to paints, from fibers to industrial solutions, the DuPont influence seeped into the material composition of the modern world. Their adaptability allowed them to transition from wartime magnates to scientific pioneers, ensuring their empire endured long after the Gilded Age had ended. Yet for all their successes, each dynasty grappled with the shadows cast by its own influence. Their rise coincided with the suffering of laborers, the exploitation of natural resources, the accumulation of unprecedented political influence, and the widening gap between wealth and poverty. Their stories force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the country's rapid ascent was powered not only by innovation and ambition, but also by inequity and sacrifice. The labor strikes that erupted across the late 19th century, from the Pullman strike to the Homestead strike, were direct responses to the conditions created by these dynasties. Workers demanded dignity, safety, and fair compensation in industries that had been built upon their exhaustion. Some of the nation's most violent clashes between labor and capital occurred under the watch of these families, revealing the human cost of industrial expansion. Environmental consequences also followed their enterprises. Oil spills, chemical waste, deforestation, and pollution became recurring outcomes of rapid industrial growth. While later generations of these families funded environmental preservation efforts, the earlier phases of their empires contributed heavily to ecological degradation. Their legacies exist not only in the museums and universities they funded, but also in the landscapes scarred by industrial ambition. Politically, their influence raised persistent concerns about the balance between private wealth and democratic governance. The Morgan's rescue of the U.S. economy in 1907 demonstrated both the necessity and the danger of concentrated financial power. The Rockefellers' near-monopolistic control of oil markets forced the government to rethink national regulatory policy. The DuPont's involvement in wartime production raised questions about profiteering. The Vanderbilt's extravagant lifestyles in the face of widespread poverty became symbols of excess. The Astors' control over social mobility highlighted the inequities in American class structures. Despite the controversies, these dynasties cultivated the philanthropic tradition that would later define American civic life. They endowed universities, museums, symphonies, libraries, and public institutions. They funded medical research, scientific exploration, and environmental conservation. They helped establish standards for charitable giving that extended beyond personal generosity and into the realm of structured, long-term societal investment. Their philanthropy became a form of soft power, one that reshaped their public image while influencing education, art, science, and culture for generations to come. By the late 20th century, these families had transitioned from being active rulers of American industry to being symbolic pillars of its heritage. Their empires evolved into trusts, foundations, and diversified holdings. Their public visibility diminished, replaced by institutional influence managed by boards, executives, and advisors who carried forward the remnants of their power. Yet even as their personal control faded, the systems they created remain. The corporate structures, financial models, industrial procedures, philanthropic frameworks, and cultural expectations that define modern American life were molded in the crucible of their ambitions. Their dynasties may no longer rule the nation as they once did, but the nation still lives inside the world they built. To understand the enduring significance of these dynasties, one must look beyond the surface of their wealth and examine the deeper cultural architecture they constructed. Their influence was not limited to the industries they controlled. It penetrated the American psyche, shaping how the nation defined success, power, class, and aspiration. Their rise provided a template for what it meant to be modern, while their decline revealed the fragility inherent in any system that concentrates power so heavily in the hands of a few. The Gilded Age, often remembered for its dazzling displays of opulence, was also a time of profound ambiguity. It represented both the triumph of industry and the peril of inequality, both innovation and exploitation, both progress and destabilization. These families embodied that duality. They were celebrated as pioneers and condemned as monopolists, admired as visionaries and criticized as opportunists. Their legacies live in that tension. For the Astors, their cultural power was perhaps their most lasting contribution. They created not only fashionable spaces but also the social grammar that governed them. Their traditions, rituals, hierarchies, and expectations shaped elite identity in ways that permeated American culture long after their personal authority waned. High society, debutante culture, philanthropic hosting, and the performance of refined status all trace their lineage to the Astor mold. Even as their power faded, the social structures they codified endured in subtle but influential cultural forms. For the Vanderbilts, their flamboyant architectural ventures revealed the emotional undercurrent of the Gilded Age, a desire to be seen, remembered, and validated in a rapidly changing world. Their mansions were not merely homes, they were monuments, built to secure a place in the national memory. Even in decay, these structures evoke awe, fascination, and a sense of tragedy. They remind us of the speed with which wealth can disappear and how fragile ambition becomes when not anchored to sustainability. Their story remains one of the greatest illustrations of the volatility of sudden fortune. The Rockefellers defied that volatility. Their disciplined stewardship, rigorous planning, and controlled public image allowed them to transition seamlessly into the era of quiet wealth. They understood early that survival depended not on display but on structure. Their investment strategies, philanthropic frameworks, and intergenerational governance created a model of stability that allowed their influence to endure far beyond the era that produced them. The Rockefeller name became a synonym for longevity, demonstrating that even in the most unpredictable economic climates, intentional legacy building could secure generational relevance. The Morgans, with their immense financial leverage, defined the thresholds of acceptable corporate power. Their interventions during national crises forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable possibility that private individuals wielded more authority than the government itself. Their story became the impetus for major reforms in banking regulation, antitrust legislation, and federal oversight. Their legacy persists in the systems designed to prevent any one institution or any one individual from replicating their level of control. In this way, the Morgans shaped not only finance, but also governance. The DuPonts interpreted the future through science. Their pivot from gunpowder to chemical innovation positioned them at the forefront of multiple technological revolutions. They became embedded in food production, household goods, pharmaceuticals, military systems, and environmental debates. Their rise mirrored America's shift from brute industrial force to scientific and technological sophistication. Their willingness to adapt, innovate, and restructure allowed them to remain relevant even as the industries around them transformed. Collectively, these dynasties reveal a fundamental truth about the Gilded Age. Power does not exist in a vacuum. It creates systems, reshapes landscapes, influences laws, and leaves legacies that extend far beyond the lifespans of those who wielded it. These families were not anomalies, they were catalysts. They accelerated the transformation of a young nation into a global power, and in doing so, they illuminated the costs and consequences of rapid expansion. Their stories remind us that the Gilded Age was not simply about wealth, it was about the construction of American identity. It was about defining the limits of ambition, the responsibilities of prosperity, and the meaning of progress. It was about learning, often painfully, how a modern nation must balance innovation with ethics, opportunity with fairness, and economic power with democratic principles. The dynasties that ruled the Gilded Age may have been shaped by their era, but they also shaped the era that followed. They influenced the rise of regulatory oversight, corporate accountability, social reform, and philanthropic responsibility. Their failures revealed what needed to change. Their successes demonstrated what was possible. And even today, their legacies remain embedded in the institutions, cities, industries, and cultural norms of the United States. Their names adorn buildings, influence political conversations, and echo in debates over inequality, corporate power, and the responsibilities of the wealthy. They may no longer sit at the center of national authority, but the structures they built continue to define the country's economic and cultural landscape. As the nation moved beyond the Gilded Age, it carried with it the indelible marks left by these dynasties, marks of brilliance, exploitation, innovation, excess, progress, and consequence. Their stories endure not because of the fortunes they amassed, but because of the foundations they laid. The Gilded Age ended, but the world it created never truly disappeared. To fully grasp how these dynasties shaped the American imagination, one must understand the psychological landscape of the late 19th century. This was a nation wrestling with contradictions, astonishing technological progress paired with widespread poverty, unprecedented wealth accumulation paired with political corruption, and a growing middle class juxtaposed against workers struggling for basic rights. Into this complexity stepped families whose fortunes seemed almost mythic, their influence stretching far beyond the tangible industries they controlled. Their presence created a national mythology, stories of self-made wealth, industrial brilliance, and the triumph of American ingenuity. Yet beneath that mythology lived the realities of labor unrest, manipulated markets, and deeply unequal access to opportunity. These families embodied both sides of that story. Their ascent symbolized possibility, but their dominance exposed the vulnerabilities of an economy dependent on so few. Over time, they became symbols, figures through which Americans projected anxieties, aspirations, frustrations, and admiration. For many, they represented hope, proof that ambition could transform the impossible into reality. For others, they were cautionary figures, whose wealth revealed everything that could go wrong in a nation without guardrails. Their stories became the battleground where Americans debated the meaning of fairness, the limits of capitalism, and the responsibilities of those who benefited most from the system. Each dynasty contributed uniquely to this national discourse. The Astors, with their meticulously constructed social hierarchy, personified exclusivity. They built an invisible architecture of belonging, rules, rituals, expectations that codified the difference between merely being wealthy and being accepted. Their world was one where money alone was not enough. Heritage, refinement, and lineage were the currencies that mattered. Their influence shaped the very vocabulary of American elitism. The Vanderbilts, by contrast, embodied the explosive force of new money. Their rise was a spectacle, a vivid display of ambition unrestrained by tradition. Their architectural creations were statements of defiance, declarations that they would not wait for permission to belong. Even their failures became part of their legend, illustrating the volatility of fortunes built on speed, audacity, and a relentless desire to dominate. They became icons of both excess and aspiration, symbols of the heights that innovation could reach and the depths to which it could fall. The Rockefellers offered a different narrative, one rooted in restraint, planning, and disciplined stewardship. Their rise was not fueled by display but by structure. They created systems, financial, philanthropic, and managerial, that ensured their longevity. Their legacy revealed that true power was not found in flaunting wealth, but in mastering it. Their influence,